Hello there! Welcome to Skanky Productions. I'm Conor Graves Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video, we're going to be starting with our History of Israel series, and this is going to be the very first part of it, right? So we're going to have it split into 5 different parts. So this video is 1799 to 1917. The next video is going to be 1917 to 48. The video after that's going to be 48 to 67. The video after that is going to be 67 to the year 2000, and then the final video is going to be the year 2000 to the present day. So with all of that, there's going to be lots of stuff, but the way to kind of look at it is that, that's why I describe it, is that this is a kind of in-depth overview. Now, some videos, such as from the great YouTube channel, Samaronow, I highly recommend you check out his channel because he goes really in depth with lots of Jewish history over the course of many thousands of years. And now his channel is starting to kind of get into the territory which we're going to be discussing today. But this video isn't like that, right? If that makes sense, because we're going to be looking at the history of the land of Israel / Palestine throughout all of this era, right? So first of all, if you like what you've seen already, don't forget obviously hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit the bell button so notified for all of our upcoming videos. We also have many videos talking about multiple different subjects, so definitely don't forget to check those out as well. You won't be disappointed at all. But also have to give a massive shout out to Jake Sussman, because he, well actually I'm assuming that's his actual name, but he recommended that I do a video on the Mandate of Palestine. And that's what got me thinking about doing a video on this. Because in this so-called in-depth overview, it's going to be different than many other videos that talk about the history of Israel. Oftentimes when people do a history of Israel, it's very kind of, they cover a great span of time with just a few words and kind of say, oh, this happened and that happened, that happened. And that's kind of not what we're going to be doing in this video or in like the rest of this series, because I think that misses out some of the important facts within it. And with history, the thing is that you have to kind of dive into the kind of like, you have to dive into the depths of it, to get a full appreciation and understanding of it. So that's what this series is going to aim to do. So without further ado, we're going to dive now into the actual beginning of our story. Now, before we actually dive into the period that we're actually talking about here, I have to make 2 quick caveats, both of which were inspired by Sam Aronow's latest video, which was Zionism before Herzl. So within that, he made the point that Jews have nearly always lived outside of the state of Israel, So as far back as 200 BC, the majority of the world's Jews lived outside of what we would today call Israel. And that's because they were involved in trading and in business across the entire Near East and the Mediterranean region. So all the different empires and all different kingdoms that they have in that time, there were Jews who lived there in different settlements and they were involved in the trade across that region. So that's the first kind of caveat we have to say, which is that Jews living in diaspora is nothing new. The second thing to talk about is the fact that the Jews, I thought that the Jews were all completely kicked out by the Romans in about 130 AD. That isn't necessarily the case, because while that is the case for Jerusalem, where Jews were kind of expelled from the city, that region of Israel / Palestine still had a majority of its population that were made up of Jews all the way up until the 5th century AD. And the reason why they stopped being the majority is because this represents the rise of Christianity in the late Roman / Byzantine Empire. So many of the people there end up converting to Christianity, and that explains why there was the shift away from there being a Jewish majority. So many Jews obviously did go to Europe and they went to many other places, and this explains part of the kind of wider diaspora. But still, the important thing to remember is that there have always been Jews living there throughout all these centuries, throughout these many millennia. So that's just something that I didn't know beforehand, but it was kind of very eye-opening. So obviously with regard to this video, you're going, hold on, you said that is going to be 1799 to 1917, you haven't even mentioned 1799. The reason being is because I'm going to give a very brief overview of the period beforehand. So I'm going to skip over lots of things. So for instance, the Kingdom of Israel and Judah, which was around in ancient times, we're not going to really talk about that. We're not going to talk about the Hellenistic period, which came after the time of Alexander the Great. We're not going to talk about the Roman conquest. We're not going to talk about the Byzantine era. We're not going to talk about the Muslim Arab conquests. We're not going to talk about the Crusades. Instead, we're now kind of skipped through all of that, and now we're at the period that we're talking about. So in 1799, the region which we today call Israel/Palestine was overwhelmingly Muslim Arabs. Now, these people had come since the time of the late 12th century, and this was with the conquest of Saladin. So during the Third Crusade, this is when the Muslims, led by Saladin, kicked out the final kind of like Christian kingdoms which had been set up there, right? And this now represents 700 years of continuous Muslim rule of this region. So during this time, this is when many Muslim Arabs migrated to the region, and this is why in 1799, 88% of the population of what is today Israel/Palestine were Muslims. Jews made up just about 3 or 4%, and the remainder was Christian Arabs. Most of the Jews tended to center around like the kind of major cities such as Jerusalem, but even there they made up just about a quarter of the population of the city. And most of the Jews who were living there lived under what was called the Old Yeshuv. So these are the Jews who continuously lived in that region throughout that entire time and never left. Now the Ottoman Turks, they're the ones who controlled the region, and they had taken it from the Mamelukes, who were another Islamic empire, and they took that in 1516. So all that time there, for almost 400 years, the Ottoman Turks ruled that region, and it was under the subdivision of the Damascus Elayat. I think I pronounced that correctly, hopefully. And the Damascus Elayat was governed by a greater region, which was known as Ottoman Syria. Now, in 1799, in comes Napoleon. Now, as we said in many of our other videos as well, where we were talking about like Napoleon's campaigns throughout Europe, so definitely check those videos out. What this basically led to was the kind of rise of nationalism throughout much of Europe. So with this, obviously you had the rise of German nationalism, Italian nationalism, etc., etc. And although it hadn't really hit this part of the world just yet, this kind of represents the very, very first step in a long road which would eventually lead to the creation of Israel and Palestine as independent national identities. Now, I'm not trying to say that people in those days immediately, when Napoleon invaded, immediately became Zionists and Arab nationalists. That's not the case at all. But this represents a sudden shift in the story, which eventually leads to what we see today. And the reason for that is because in 1799, when Napoleon ended up invading Egypt and Ottoman Syria, this is where, during the siege of Accra, he made a proclamation which said that all the Jews of Asia and Africa ought to come together under his banner, and together they would restore a biblical Jerusalem, and they would create a homeland for the Jews. Now, it's important to note that he didn't mention the European Jews, because in this period he was actually in the process of emancipating many of them, because there was still many anti-Semitic laws throughout Europe which basically deprived them of citizenship within their different kingdoms. So this was something that he was kind of very much focused on within Europe. That's probably why he didn't end up actually including them. Now, this obviously didn't lead to the establishment of the State of Israel, mainly for two reasons. One, because most of the Jews didn't actually rally to his cause, and the second of all was because he was defeated at the siege of Accra. So, we kind of didn't end up hearing anything from this, and he kind of just went back to Europe to do his campaigns. But still, this represents the first time in almost 2,000 years that anyone had spoken about the re-establishment of a Jewish state in the land of Israel. Now, in 1805, you had Muhammad Ali of Egypt. And what he did is he basically split away Egypt from the rest of the Ottoman Empire, and he basically wanted to set up his own empire within its own rights. So in 1831, he invaded Ottoman Syria, and this is where he did some very unpopular things. Most notably of all was that he tried to conscript the local peasants, right? Now, the local people there, most of which were Arabs, they end up protesting against him. But what they did in 1834 was, in these series of riots, they targeted the religious minorities within the region, most notably the Christians and the Jews. Now, the reason I mention this is because during this whole time where the Muslims were in charge, Jews and Christians were so-called dhimmis, so they were like second-class citizens. They're still respected under the, as people of the book, but at the same time they don't have the same kind of rights as everyone else. But still, up until this time, they had been largely protected, and much more so than was the case for Jews living in Christian Europe. However, this represents the kind of first notable time where we can see Jews being targeted. And then 4 years later, in 1838, this is where we see the Druze rise up, right? So the Druze are another kind of religious minority that live within the region. And again, these people rose up and they targeted Jews. Now, this led to a huge reaction within Europe, in particular led by Moses Montefiore. So Moses Montefiore was a very wealthy British Jew. He was, a financier, he was a banker, he was a philanthropist, and also he was the first Jewish sheriff of London. So this is the very first high office which is held by any non-Christian within England. So what he did is he ended up meeting with Muhammad Ali Pasha, who a few years before had basically rounded up all of like the local Arabs who had been in revolt and had done all these things. He deported them to Egypt, and then he moved many loyal Egyptian Arabs to the region. So many of the Palestinians today are actually the descendants of Egyptians who were brought over during this time, right? We don't have exact figures because record keeping in these times were notoriously bad, right? So what Moses Montefiore did is that when he met with Pasha, he made an agreement with him to set up between 100 and 200 Jewish villages, within the state of Palestine. And this is where people fleeing from persecution could come and settle, and so that was the original plan. However, the Egyptians end up losing that territory in 1840, and it went back to the Ottoman Turks. But the region was still very poor, it was still very underdeveloped, and it just didn't have any agricultural or financial base, right? So you have to think about the fact that Jews are being persecuted all around Europe and stuff, right? So the question then would be, why didn't any of them flee to Palestine? The reason being, it was as bad as the repression was in many places in Europe, Europe still had a much higher standard of living than the land of Palestine, because Palestine was just dirt poor, right? So the few people who happened to move there, most of them were either religious scholars or they were secular intellectuals, and neither of those kind of groups tended to have a lot of expertise when it came to farming. So while they came there with the idea of, we're going to go there and set up like farms and stuff, very quickly they end up abandoning these farms and just move to the major cities anyway, right? So like we said, we don't have like great records throughout this period, but what we can work out is that from about the mid to the late 19th century, this is where there were a few Jews that end up settling there. And this is why the population of Jerusalem, for the first time in many, many centuries, end up becoming majority Jewish. So by 1896, it's estimated that about 62% of the population of the city of Jerusalem were Jewish. However, it still was a situation where only about 4% of the population of the entire region were Jewish still, right? So, like we said, the Jews are very heavily concentrated in a handful of major cities. Now, Europe during this time had basically replaced religious bigotry with scientific bigotry. And what we could see, we're in this age of nationalism, is this thing of scientific racism. So people basically saying that the Jews are a distinct nation, that they can never become part of the nation. So whether it's France or Germany or many of the other places, right, they can never be fully trusted. They will always be a fifth column. They will always have their loyalty questioned and stuff, right? And so this led to a huge amount of repression and a lot of pogroms against the Jews of Europe, in particular within the Russian Empire, where a huge number of them lived. So it's estimated that about 2.3 million Jews end up fleeing during this time from the Russian Empire, with about 80% of them, or like 1.9 million, fleeing to the United States. About 140,000 went to Britain during this time, so roughly about 7%. Again, these figures are subject to kind of change stuff because, depending on what figures you're looking at. Then many of them went to France and Holland and many other kind of like liberal places in Europe and the rest of the world. But during this whole time, so from 1882 to 1903, just 35,000 Jews settled in the land of Palestine. And again, these guys pretty much just stayed mainly in the cities. However, within this group, there were a great range of different people. So you had some people who were religious, some people who were secular, you had some people who were nationalists, and you had some people who were socialists. And many of them brought with them the ideas of Zionism, right? Which was something which was really starting to take root in the late 19th century. And this represents basically Jewish nationalism, is basically the idea of establishing a Jewish homeland in the land of Palestine. So whereas before a handful of Jews had kind of moved there for religious reasons, just to be close to Jerusalem, Now there was an active push for people to settle in this land. And many of these Jews who came there, right, they brought expertise, yeah, on like different farming techniques and different industrial practices, etc., which they took from being in Europe, and they brought it to this region. And they also brought a revival of the Hebrew language, yeah, which had been kind of dormant for many centuries, right? So now you're starting to see the beginnings of the birth of a like real nation of Israel come through. But of course, we'd be remiss to kind of ignore the fact of the vast majority of people living there, which were Muslim Arabs, right? So they obviously weren't just sitting about during this time. They also had their own movements and desires and hopes and dreams, right? And so in around the 1860s, you start to have the rise of Arab nationalism. So where this Arab nationalism kind of like spurred from, right, was the fact of in the late 19th century, the Islamic world had really fallen behind the West. Whereas a few centuries before, the Islamic world was the center of the whole world. So many of the people, especially the Arabs, yeah, they looked at the Ottoman Turks who were ruling much of this Muslim world, and they said that the reason for their decline was as a result of their decadence and their decay. So only the Arabs could actually spur this kind of revitalization. And so that's where Arab nationalism took root. Of course, most Arabs were just, like loyal subjects of the Ottoman Empire. They didn't really question things. But still, by the outbreak of World War One, the year before, in 1913, you had the very first Arab Congress, which was held in Paris, of all places, right? So this is the first time when Arab intellectuals, Arab leaders and stuff, yeah, came together to discuss what a unified Arab state would look like. And now you can start to see two opposite and opposing forces almost begin to collide. So you have Zionism and you have Arab nationalism, and they're almost about to start butting heads, right? But in this period, the Ottomans still controlled this region. Everything's all kind of stayed exactly as it has for centuries until World War One happened. So with World War One, the Ottomans declare war against the Allies. So the British in 1916, they go to the Arabs, yeah, in particular to the Sharif of Mecca, and basically this is where we see the beginning of the Arab revolt. So the Arab citizens within the Ottoman Empire rise up, and they rise up to support the British upon the promise that when the war is over, they will be given a unified Arab state. Now, the British and the French had other plans, right? So in 1916, you had the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and within this basically carved up much of the land into different mandates. So you'd have the French controlling Syria and Lebanon, and you have the British controlling Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine. So on the 11th of December 1917, this is where General Edmund Allenby marches through the gates of Jerusalem, and this marks the first time that a non-Muslim had control of the city. And just a month before that, you had the Balfour Declaration. Now, within this declaration, this is the first time where the British offer and promise that there will be a homeland for the Jews in the land of Palestine. But it comes with the proviso that the other different religious groups within there, whether it be the Muslims or the Christians, who obviously still make up the majority, they and their civil rights and their religious rights must still be protected. So that is something which was in the Balfour Declaration. And this is finally the point at which we can see these two opposing forces start to collide. So that's what we're going to explore more into the next video when we look at the history of the Mandate of Palestine. So this is where Zionism and Arab nationalism is really going to start butting heads. But if you like this video, don't forget obviously hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified, and also as well, check out our many other videos that we have on many different topics. You won't be disappointed. And with that, have a great day and bye.